Well, hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Nick Schatz. I'm one of the pastors here. Excited to open up God's Word with you today. It's been an exciting month in the life of our church. Thanks, man. It's been an exciting month in the life of our church. We just had a team get back from a missions trip to Tanzania, and I saw somebody here that went on that trip. Oh, there you are, Ray. Good trip, I guess. So they just got back from Tanzania. We also had our branch group, a young adult group in our church, get back from a retreat. It's the first one that we've had young adults do this before in the past, but this is the first time that this group of people has done something like that. I also was talking to Nick Mance and to Bridget as well, and not long ago they had sign-ups for Winter Blast, which is a winter retreat our teenagers go on. They had over 140 people sign up this year, and there's a wait list because there's only so many beds and stuff like that we can take people. So that's the most that we've ever taken on a trip like that before. We have 10 baptisms happening today, so just an exciting time, an exciting week. All of you who are involved in these different things, all of you who maybe just give to the church faithfully so that these things can happen, thanks for being a part of all that. But enough about that. We're going to be in James chapter 3 today, James chapter 3. If you have a Bible with you, go ahead and turn there. If you're using one of the Bibles in the pews, it's on page 979. Isn't that wild? There's so many pages in the Bible. It's on page 979, so you can go ahead and turn there. While you're turning there, I want to see if you know this lady in the picture. I want to see if you know who this lady in the portrait is. Anybody know who it is? I hear a few mumblings, but I can't make out any. If I just mumble it softly, maybe he'll think I know the answer. This is Lady Macbeth. It's from a play by Shakespeare, of course, from the play Macbeth. Lady Macbeth is one of the leading characters. She's someone who is hungry for power, hungry for authority. She wants to be the Queen of England. What she does is, if you've seen it or read it, she manipulates and coerces her husband into taking the life of the acting king. And then once that happens, once she has convinced him to do that and the king is dead, she becomes the Queen of Scotland. She gets the power that she has and the authority she has always wanted. Of course, in the coming days, the guilt from this decision, from this action, just wears on her, and she feels immense guilt. There's even this climactic scene in which she is pacing in the room, and she is sleepwalking, and as she is sleepwalking, she's rubbing her hands together as if she's doing some kind of washing moment, or a washing movement with her hands, trying to cleanse her hands of this sin that she committed metaphorically. And as she is doing this, she is repeating this phrase that has become infamous. "Out stained, out, I say, will my hands ever be clean again?" Because even though she's committed this atrocious act, she feels as if her physical body is even contaminated or stained. She's impure. She feels dirty for what she's done, and she wants to wash her hands of the situation. Interestingly, us humans are a little fickle, a little funny when it comes to purity and cleanness, because sometimes when we think something wrong, when we watch something that's bad, that's unethical, unmoral, when we do something or say something, sometimes our physical bodies can feel contaminated in a way. There were some researchers, really interesting study back in 2006. They did this study where they brought in these participants, and they had them read different stories. Some of the stories were good, some of the stories were bad, something unethical, something atrocious, something bad happened in some of the stories. And they had them read these very carefully. And those who read the bad stories, at the end, they had this compulsion. They really wanted to wash their hands afterwards. Isn't that interesting? They replicated the study. Maybe they weren't sure if it was quite accurate, if they did something wrong, so they replicated the study and did it a little bit differently. And this time what they did was they had the people read the stories, and once again, at the end of the stories, they allowed people to choose from a few different, very inexpensive small gifts, like a parting reward for their time spent doing the study. And those who read the unethical, the immoral stories most often chose antiseptic wipes as their parting gift. They just felt, I don't know, it was a made-up story. It wasn't real. They didn't do anything, but they read this story and they just felt like Lady Macbeth trying to wash their hands of, they felt stained or polluted or contaminated from what they had read or what they experienced or what they were thinking about. I say those stories and I show you this picture because it illustrates a principle that we're going to learn from Scripture today from James chapter 3. Go ahead and follow along with me. I'm going to read verses 13 through 18 of James chapter 3. "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambitions in your heart, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom," he says with quotes, "does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, There you will find disorder and every evil practice. Verse 17, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is, first of all, pure, and then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy, full of good fruit, impartial, sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. So this morning, we'll come back to this text and read different parts of it again. We're going to focus mostly on verse 17. Pastor George focused on the first few verses of that text. But here's what I want you to walk away with today. Here's kind of a big idea if you summarize this all in just a one word. It's that God's wisdom, the wisdom that comes from heaven, he says in verse 17, God's wisdom is contagious. It is contagious, okay? And let me explain what I mean by that. So the guy who wrote this portion of Scripture, his name was James. That's why we call it the book of James. James grew up in the early first century, and he grew up in a Jewish household. And according to ancient Judaism, you were constantly living in fear of being contaminated with different impurities. Okay, I'm not picking on the Jewish faith. This is just, if you read the Old Testament and ancient Judaism, there was a constant fear, there was a constant weariness of being contaminated by different impurities. You didn't want to become impure, you didn't want to become unclean, and so there were all these things you avoided. You avoided contact with sinful people. You avoided contact at certain places. You didn't want to leave the holy city and stray too far from Jerusalem, not for too long. You didn't want to enter a room in which a death had occurred, because just entering the room, just being in the room, could contaminate you. You could become unclean. And so there was a constant fear of becoming morally unclean in the same way that would make you have to ritually wash your hands of the situation. However, James also, he grew up in that culture, but he also grew up watching his older brother. Anybody know who James's older brother was? Jesus, yeah, Jesus. Well, he has a few brothers, yes, but so Jesus was one of his older brothers. Can you imagine being Jesus' brother? Why can't you be more like Jesus? So he grew up watching his older brother, and his older brother just had a completely different take on this idea of purity. Our text says, first of all, God's wisdom is pure. So he had a different take on purity and contamination and cleanliness. And so what Jesus would do is he had no problems walking into a room where a death had occurred, or sitting with those who were mourning the death of their loved one, or walking into the room and even touching the corpse of the dead body. He had no issues doing that. He had no issues befriending and having lunch and sharing meals and interacting with sinful people, with stuck-up religious people. He had no issues leaving the holy city for extended periods of time and going into Gentile territory. He had no issues doing this. And here's the thing. Instead of Jesus fearing being contaminated, his concern was contaminating them. And over again, we see that Jesus does not become unclean by these influences. Instead, his influence makes others clean. And so God's wisdom, we're going to see, is something that is contagious. And James has learned this from his older brother. There's a lot of repetition from the Sermon on the Mount and different things that Jesus taught throughout the book of James. He's trying to show us that God's wisdom is contagious. And we spread it by doing two things. Number one, by showing it, and then by sowing it. Okay? I didn't make this up. This comes from the two main verbs that are in the text. In verse 13, he says, who's wise and understanding, but let him show it. Okay, wisdom isn't something you know, it's something you show. So he says to show it. And then at the very end, in verse 18, he talks about there's this sowing act. You sow and then you reap. Okay, I know the two main verbs here start with an S and rhyme. That wasn't clever of me. That just happens to be the case. But wisdom is contagious, and we spread it by showing it and by sowing it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's jump in and look at that first verb, the verb show. Look at verse number 13, James 3:13. The text says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it. You see, according to James, there's two kinds of people out there. There's people who know the right thing to do, and there's people that actually do it. And the real wise guys are the ones who actually do it. They actually go out and show it. Wisdom isn't something you know, it's something you show. I learned this the hard way 15 years ago. 15 years ago, I became a pastor for the very first time. I also became married for the very first time. I've only been married once, by the way. So I was a brand new husband, a brand new pastor. I was 1 month into marriage and also into pastoring. And then somebody contacted me, and they said they were having issues in their marriage, and they wanted to have some marriage counseling. Now, I heard that phone call, and I eagerly said, yes, I would be glad to help you. I would be happy to help you. Because after all, I had just gotten a college degree from Bible college. I had taken a class on marriage, right? There was another course I took. I think it was a very short, like 1 credit course or something like that, an easier course on the Christian family. I was a newlywed, so I had been reading for months now marriage books. I had read probably 5 or 6 marriage books. I mean, the newest stuff on the market, right? Gary Chapman, or, I don't know what I was out 15 years ago. I had read the books, highlighted them. I had even taken a course on Intro to Counseling, okay? There was a big book I had to read. I mean, I felt thoroughly qualified. Furthermore, I had been happily married for 1 month. I felt I was thoroughly qualified to go through this stuff with them. And so we had them over. We met for a couple of sessions. For some reason, it didn't occur to me to ask them any questions. I didn't ask them why they reached out. I just told them pretty much everything I knew about marriage. It took about 2 sessions. So I did these sessions, and then I had a rude awakening. A few days later, the guy calls me. We'll call him Wesley. So Wesley calls me up. Hey, Pastor Nick, can you give me a ride to the hospital? I said, sure, man, I'd be happy to. What's going on? I assumed maybe he had a kid or a friend or something that was hospitalized. He needed a ride. He wanted to visit us. I didn't know what was happening. So I said, yeah, sure. What's going on? He said, well, my wife stabbed me in the leg with a kitchen knife, and then she ran off with her car, and I'm bleeding pretty bad here. Yeah, dude, I'll be right there. So I rush over, and I kid you not, I'm in the car with this guy driving, and I have no idea what to say. All those books I read, what in the world? Like, I have no idea what to tell this guy. And all that I could muster out was, hey, man, I think you should get professional help. I think there's somebody, all the books I read, my whole month of marriage, it just really didn't help in this situation. So James, according to James, wisdom isn't something you know or read in a book. Wisdom is something that you show, and as you show it, it spreads, it becomes contagious to other people. Okay, so that's the real wise guys, the ones who show it. Again, he learned this from his older brother, from big brother Jesus. Here's something that Jesus said in James 13:17. Now that you know these things, God will bless you for what? Doing them. Matthew 7:24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man, okay? Wisdom isn't something you know, it's something you show. Here, let's go back to James. Here's some of the ways, some of the attributes, some of the overpouring of if you're a wise person, if you have God's wisdom, this is some of the way that wisdom shows itself in your relationships. Verse 17, James 3:17. The wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. God's wisdom, this goes against conventional wisdom, the wisdom of this world. God's wisdom, it's considerate, and that consideration hopefully spreads to others, leading them to be considerate. God's wisdom is submissive, and that submission hopefully rubs off on other people. Rather than I'm standing my ground, no, it's a submissive kind of wisdom. It is impartial, and hopefully that impartiality, it's not partisan, it's not I'm going to stand my ground and we're going to have different lines. It's I'm willing to listen to you, and usually that's reciprocated. It is a contagious wisdom, okay? Speaking of all this contagion, right? Some of you want to wash your hands right now. Speaking of all this contagion, I want to reference a book for you that I think would be helpful if you'd like to read it. It's called Contagious Holiness by Craig Blomberg. And so in this book, he talks about this concept that Jesus was the one who was contagious for others rather than interacting with sinful people or going to sinful places maybe rubbed off on him, that Jesus was the contagious one. And in the book, he specifically studies, you can see it in the subtitle if you can read that tiny screen there, he studies the meals of Jesus. You see, there's at least 18 different meals that Jesus shares with different people throughout the Gospels. And he mostly, with one exception, he shares meals with 3 different kinds of people. He eats with sinful people, and by that I mean people that were known in the community for living immoral, unethical lifestyles. They were living lifestyles that they were frowned upon. You don't want your kids to be doing that. Okay, he met and ate and shared meals, very taboo, with sinful people. Number 2, he ate meals with seekers, those who were trying to figure out, this is my own outline, so he didn't necessarily spell it out this way, but with people who weren't quite sure what they believe or what they think about Jesus or Judaism or any of these other religions, so seekers. And then number 3, he also ate with people on the very other end of the spectrum, the super religious, okay? Those who were Pharisees, those who were holier than thou. They thought they were more important, they were better than other people, that they were the untouchables, that they were the most sacred and holy people, real stuck-up kind of people. And we can't zoom in on it, and I doubt you can see the picture very well on the cover there, but that little bitty picture, that little red picture, that's a painting that comes from Luke chapter 7. And that's the story of Jesus sharing a meal, and there's 2 very different people that are around him, okay? One is a Pharisee. The text in Luke 7 says that he is a leader of the Pharisees. So he's one of the top kahinas. He's one of the big cheeses of the Pharisees. Very religious person. He really thought that he was better than all these other people. Just a holier than thou kind of personality. Jesus is sharing a meal with him. And then in walks a woman who is living some kind of sinful lifestyle because everyone else at the table knows it. She knows that she's not welcome. She shouldn't be here. She certainly shouldn't be walking up and sitting at the feet of Jesus and kissing his feet. This is highly inappropriate. Why is she even in the room? The text says that she is a woman of the city. I don't know exactly what that means. You don't know exactly what that means, but we can kind of put two and two together and figure out the kind of lifestyle that she was living. And what we see in the story is that Jesus is in no way concerned about the snobbishness of the Pharisee rubbing off on him. He is in no way concerned about the sinfulness of the woman rubbing off on him. Instead, his only concern is rubbing off on these other people. He wants to spread his holiness and his purity, we could say his wisdom. He wants to be the one that is contagious for these other people rather than constantly fearing, I'm going to be unclean from this interaction. He is contagious. And so in a world that was fearful of moral contamination, James tells us that God's wisdom is what's contagious, and we spread it by showing it and by sowing it, okay? We hyper-focused on that word showing a little bit, so let's kind of hyper-focus on the other one, on this sowing, this concept. I won't get too much into it because Pastor George is going to really focus on verse 18 next week, but there's this sowing and reaping component. Look at back at verse 17. I'll just read the first part because we've read it a few times now. The wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure. And all these other attributes, they all stem. It's not like peace-loving is number 2 and considerate is number 3. No, all these other attributes come out of purity. Purity. When's the last time you thought about purity or used the word purity? Probably not very often. Maybe you bought a necklace and you hoped it was pure gold, or that's pure country music right there. I don't know. We don't use the word pure very often. But if you were an ancient Jew, you thought about purity every single day. You were constantly thinking about purity and remaining pure and not becoming unclean and not becoming contaminated by moral or ritual impurity around you. In fact, if you were an ancient Jew, there was a hierarchy of purity, okay? Here's a hierarchy. Certain things were sacred. The temple and certain rooms within the temple, and certain people could enter certain rooms in the temple, and there were objects that were sacred. They were set apart from God, and stepping down from that was clean. Clean's a very good thing. Common was just a neutral term. Then there's unclean. The most impure, the most unclean thing would be known as something that is profane. And if you were an ancient Jew or if you were someone who grew up in the culture that James did, you were constantly worried about, if I sit on the wrong couch, I could become unclean. If I enter the wrong room, I could be unclean. If I touch the wrong thing, I could be unclean. If I eat the wrong thing, I could be unclean. If I sit at a table with the wrong person, I could become unclean. And then to become clean again was this whole ordeal. Let me show you another picture. I know I'm full of pictures today because they're worth 1,000 words. I guess it's a long sermon today. So we have this picture of a purification ritual that is happening. There's candles and there's a dove for sacrifice. Someone is praying there. There's a priest that is present. Going from unclean to clean again, it was this whole ordeal. And so people were constantly worried about being contaminated and becoming unclean. We got to stay away from the Gentiles. We got to stay away from the sinners of our town. We got to stay away from the tax collectors. And if anybody is sick, we have to stay away from that. We could be contaminated. But James also watched his older brother flip the script. Here's a very different picture. This is a picture of Jesus healing a leper. This is a picture painting from 1864 by Jean Marie Doze. It's a picture of him healing a leper. These were people you didn't touch. This is so taboo. You don't touch lepers. You become unclean for all. It's such an ordeal. But Jesus would consistently go and interact with these kind of people and then spread his virtues to other people. He was the one that was contagious. He would interact with lepers, those with blood issues, those with different illnesses. He would not shy away from death. And I'm telling you, if there was even a funeral procession going on and the shadow cast from that casket touched your foot, you were declared unclean. But Jesus would walk right into the room and sometimes touch the corpse. And instead of him becoming contaminated, sometimes the corpse would come to life. Somehow his cleanness and purity and wisdom spread to everybody else. And he was not the one infected. Here's how Dr. Blomberg puts it in that book that I showed you a second ago. He writes, Jesus has shown himself unwilling to follow his culture's traditions about not associating with the ritually impure and morally wicked. He does not assume that he will be defiled by associating with corrupt people. Rather, his purity can rub off on them and change them for the better. Cleanliness, he believes, is even more catching than uncleanness. Morality more influential than immorality. Jesus was the one who was contagious in all of these situations. Let's look at this verse again in James 3:17. We talked about purity. The wisdom from heaven is first of all pure, and then here's other examples of what wisdom looks like. I'm sure James didn't have an exhaustive list in mind, like it's these 8 things, but here's some other examples of what it looks like. It's peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy, full of good fruit, impartial, sincere. And once again, these are meant to be things that you sow and then later reap 100-fold more. These are things that you spread by contagion. Usually when we think of the word peace, that's the first one there. When we think of the word peace, we think of the avoidance of evil. We think of preventing war from happening. We think of peace being the neutral act of no violence and to stop fighting. But the peace that James has in mind here, it's a shalom peace. It's not the elimination of war, but it's the promotion of peace. It's not negative peace, it is positive peace. It's not keeping people from fighting, but promoting and helping people get along in a peaceful and thriving and shalom kind of way. The same kinds of things could be said about these other, 6 different virtues, and some of them we've already talked about. Maybe a good way to sum up this principle here comes from Neil Chesterton. He says, people are vessels. They hold whatever is poured into them. And then they pour that out, likewise. God's wisdom is contagious, and you spread it by showing it and sowing it. I know I've showed a lot of pictures today. I have one more. I guess I like paintings today. Here's one more. This is a sketch that is in my house. It's on my wife's desk. My wife has kind of a home office, a home desk at home, and this is a portrait of a woman. She's in the middle there, if you can see it. I know it's a little small on the screen, who had a hematology disorder. She had some kind of blood disorder where she was frequently bleeding, and the doctors for years, not for a week, not for a month, I mean, this was years of time in which she was just constantly bleeding and the pain and also the shame that comes with that. Because she had this blood disorder, she was also in a constant state of uncleanness, unable to become ritually or morally, in their minds, clean. Always unclean. People would avoid her. Nobody wanted to touch her. You don't want to touch someone who's unclean because you can become unclean, and there goes your week, right? I mean, it's just like, man, I got to go to the priest and light the candles and all that kind of stuff. And so she was considered unclean. She's in town one day, and she sees Jesus. She hears Jesus. He has become famous. There's a crowd of people that are around him, and so she actually crawls through the crowd and reaches out and touches him. And that is the moment in which Jesus should have become unclean. And here goes his week. He's got to go through the rituals and bring the dove and all that kind of stuff. This is the moment where he should have become unclean. But instead, he remains clean, and the woman, his purity, his holiness is spread to her. He's the one that is contagious, and you can tell by the colors in the picture that his purity has spread to her. By way of review, for James, wisdom isn't something that you know, it's something you show. Wisdom isn't something you keep up here. Wisdom is something that you show and you sow. You spread this around, and it is contagious. Rather than fearing the contamination of others or interacting with others who think different, act different, don't follow Jesus, whatever, we are the ones who are to be contagious in showing God's wisdom. And so I want to challenge you to be infectious, contagious with your faith, to live out these attributes that we have read about. And one last note, some of you in here, maybe you're not a Christian, maybe you're considering where you fall, maybe you're watching online right now, watching the live stream, someone shared the link with you or invited you, whatever the case, and you're not a Christian. And this might be a little bit interesting. In fact, I even emailed Dr. Blomberg and said, hey, is this the kind of principle that's shown in any other religion? He said, no, this is exclusive to Christianity. I know we tend to think, all religions kind of teach basically the same thing, but man, on the important things, we're just totally different. Christianity is so unique because in every other religion, everyone is trying to wash their hands of their sins and become pure before their deity. Everyone's trying to cleanse themselves of the wickedness of this world and become moral in their God's sight. But this is the only religion in which, no, Jesus paid the price for our sin. And his purity just spread. He just infects us with his purity. Simply by believing in Jesus, our sins are forgiven. There's no action we have to do. This is totally unique. No other religion teaches anything like this. And so if this is something you would like to explore, I encourage you to talk to me afterwards or a member of our prayer team that'll be here at the front. But thank you for your kind attention. Let me pray for you before we move on with our day today. Father, I want to thank you for the example of Jesus and wise living. There's many of us in this room, me included, who have given considerable thought and energy to advancing our careers or our education or our influence, our expertise in different ways. And that's not a bad thing. But Father, I want to pray that just this week, that myself and the rest of us in this room, that we would devote considerable time and attention and energy to wisdom. And that we would try to live out and foster the attributes of God's wisdom that we read about in this text, these 8 different attributes, and that we would try to increase those in our life and advance our wisdom. I pray this to you, Father, in the name of your Son, Jesus, and by the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you so much for coming and for your kind attention today here in the room and online. 3 very brief announcements. First off, if you'd like to pray with a member of our prayer team, they're going to be up front. And in fact, if you're on the prayer team, you can go ahead and come up now. Secondly, we have a baptism at the second service. And I would encourage you, if you have kiddos, I would encourage you to grab them from Kids Step, come right back in here. This is, if you've been waiting for an opportunity to have a conversation about, hey, what do you want to do with your life? And are you ready to make this faith your own? I mean, this is the perfect lead-in to talk about what they have just seen and experienced here. If they watch these baptism stories, it gives you the perfect lead-in to talk about following Jesus for life with your kids later on. So I encourage you to come right back here and watch this. There's no more sermon. You don't have to listen to me again. It's just music, and then we'll do the baptism. And then lastly, I just want to remind you that I refuse to dismiss you. Instead, I'm going to send you. You are not being dismissed, you are being sent. Hershey, you are being sent to grow in God's wisdom. You are being sent not just to know wisdom, but to show it. So you are not dismissed, but you are sent. Thank you very much.